Welcome to this final class in this first course. In this last class, I'll proceed by going through the questions I gave you last time around. Let's just remind ourselves of what they are. If I have spent quite a lot of time offering a friendly critique of cynical theories in the past two lectures, I think it's safe to say I'm going to engage in unbridled praise of the book in this lecture, as I rehearse what a reader might have enjoyed in it. That said, I will turn my attention to a necessary supplement to what gets said in this chapter at the end of this lecture. So to start off then with that first question there. Now there's much to admire in the opening section of this chapter. Again, no sort of subheading. So the opening contrastive section, where liberalism is compared favorably to theory, is one of the most rhetorically striking parts of the book, I would say. The observation that postmodern theory exploits liberalism's strengths and weaknesses to criticize it is fascinating. The admission that it is difficult to define liberalism and that it is difficult to even limit its evolution to one period is thought-provoking. The concession that economic liberalism is deeply flawed, and the material about how the US found it necessary to adjust the liberal political order of democracy is also important. That said, I think the authors would have been advised to have left democracy out of a discussion comparing classical liberalism and theory in its different manifestations. As I started to suggest in the very first lecture, it is perhaps suboptimal to view democracy as an aspect of liberalism, even if the two are very much bound up with one another. As Francis Fukuyama says in his most recent book, the two, liberalism and democracy, are, and I quote, based on distinct principles and institutions. And of course, by including considerations of democracy in the discussion, it can start to feel as though the authors are comparing like with unlike, as it were. Theory, while it offers alternatives to liberalism, doesn't, thankfully, offer alternatives to democracy. So perhaps it's better to exclude considerations of democracy when speaking of liberalism and comparing it to theory. Moving on, and still working with that first question, under the heading, why freedom of debate is so important, the authors then provide an illuminating short discussion of how John Stuart Mill conceived of the self-harming nature of censorship, and that's very, very useful. Two harms affect the opponent of an idea in Mill's view, they explain. So emphasizing the fact that censorship actually harms the censor, as it were. The two authors are drawing on chapter 2 of Mill's On Liberty. I found it interesting that they stuck to chapter 2. Interestingly, in his more recent The Constitution of Knowledge, Jonathan Rauch also speaks of chapter 2, but then goes on to speak of what he calls the relatively neglected chapter 3 of On Liberty. And when speaking of chapter 3, Rauch observes, Mill held that the most dire threat to freedom comes not from state repression, but from social conformity, which leads to a shortage of diversity of inclination and interest and talent, but especially, he implied, diversity of opinion. It's fascinating to be reminded of the fact that perhaps Mill thought of the direst threat to freedom coming from social conformity, but nonetheless, it's fascinating how the authors of cynical theories attach their ruminations on postmodernism to Mill's idea of the harms affecting the opponent of an idea. The authors then speed through some really good sources in the next section of their book, which is called Theory Doesn't Understand Liberalism. Pinker, Fawcett, and Gopnik are all excellent sources here. Of special interest is Gopnik's idea that liberalism is ineluctably connected to humanism. I'd like to teach a course on humanists at some point. And a good book for such a course, I think, would be William Kaelin's fascinating study, 20th Century Humanist Critics. That's a book in which he speaks about some of my own favorite humanists, as it were, C.S. Lewis, Northrop Frye, and various others. Also of interest in this section is Fawcett's 4 themes of liberalism, which the authors list as, and I quote, acceptance of conflict, resistance to power, faith in progress, and respect for persons. The liberal principle of tolerance is referenced a couple of times here, which is welcome, seeing as not enough stress has been placed on tolerance in the book, one might argue. I'm delighted to read the next section, Liberal Science, dedicated to Jonathan Rauch's book, Kindly Inquisitors, which of course he wrote before writing the Constitution of Knowledge. In this section, we learn that there are 4 epistemic alternatives to the epistemic liberal principle. And we learn that Rauch names these the fundamentalist principle, the simple egalitarian principle, the radical egalitarian principle, and the humanitarian principle. Along the way, we are introduced to Rauch's conception of a decidedly bogus freedom, the freedom of knowledge, which is disavowed by the liberal principle. The author's enlightening discussion concludes with the warning that adopting any principle other than the liberal principle leads to what they call the denominalization of knowledge, each denomination having its authoritative knowledge, as it were. I myself started out with Rauch's latest work, The Constitution of Knowledge, and this discussion was actually at the time of first reading my introduction to Rauch's earlier work, the Kindly Inquisitors. The account of how the liberal principle which drives epistemic liberalism contrasts with 4 illiberal alternatives is fascinating. When reading and rereading the Constitution of Knowledge, I felt that something was perhaps missing, a response to the idea that those who belong to oppressed groups should be listened to more than others. And reading what Pluckrose and Lindsay say about the Kindly Inquisitors, I realized that Rauch had already addressed that point in this earlier book. To advance such an argument is to predicate your thinking on what they call or what he calls the radical egalitarian principle, a grave error in his view, of course. Moving on to the next section, although we'll actually come back to the next section, the principles and themes in light of liberalism, seeing as my second question invited us to respond to that. So moving on to the section titled Fuel for the Identity Politics of the Extreme Right. Again, there's lots to laud and praise the authors for here. They usefully advance the argument that the politics of the identarian left are helping to bring about a resurgence in right-wing identity politics. They rehearse a brief history of the triumphs of liberalism in the second half of the 20th century, before stating that, and I quote, critical social justice threatens to reverse and seems to be reversing much of this progress. The 2 authors then go through 2 problems with social justice ideology. 1, it reinscribes negative stereotypes against women and racial and sexual minorities. And 2, it encourages tribalism and hostility by its aggressively divisive approach. The identity politics of the left encourages identity politics of the right, largely on account of that second problem, which is tied in with the idea of collective blame and the notion that it's acceptable to be prejudiced towards dominant groups. Theory-inspired social interventions can alienate white people, men, and so on. And those are obviously viewed unfavorably by the authors. So again, lots to enjoy in that section. In the next section, a brief discussion of solutions. The authors advance a fine defense of secularism and the idea that people must be able to believe what they will, adding that secularism goes with, and I quote, the inalienable right to reject the moral injunctions and prescriptions of any particular ideology without blame. They then usefully advance two principles to tackle reified postmodernism. Number one, we must oppose the institutionalization of its belief system. And two, we must do fair battle with the ideas of social justice. The ideology must not be prescribed, researchers must not be defunded, etc. Moving on to the final section of this chapter. The chapter concludes with an excellent rehearsal of four kinds of principled opposition. The idea is that these represent, and I quote, a few examples of how you can recognize social injustice while rejecting the solutions the ideology of uppercase social justice proposes. So lots to celebrate, lots to enjoy in the book, of course. So my second question invited you to focus on one of the subsections that we just sprinted past, the one about the two postmodern principles and the four postmodern themes. What do we make of their assessment of these principles and themes? Again, I can only commend most of what they say, but let's rehearse again how a reader might react to this dimension of the book. So I would say that the commentary on the postmodern knowledge principle is useful. Perhaps we should listen and consider even more, which is of course what they advocate. Perhaps that is the positive legacy of epistemic postmodernism. Of course, the authors wisely add that listen and consider is hardly the same as listen and believe, a rather important distinction. Moving on to the postmodern political principle, the two don't give much quarter to the postmodern political principle. They concede that, yes, harmful discourses can gain undue power, masquerade as legitimate knowledge, and thus damage society and harm people, and we should remain aware of this. The postmodern idea that people are born into certain discourses that shape their understanding is worth considering, they say, but that's pretty much it. The level of critique here feels just about right, and the aggressive debunking of ideas like internalized racism and sexism, these are especially piquant and welcome as well. Moving on to the themes, what they say about the blurring of boundaries is interesting, but I, for one, would have liked a slightly more extended iteration of the points they're trying to get across. What exactly are they saying about men and women, and how society should accommodate distinctions without setting up fake differences? I'm not quite sure. Perhaps just a little criticism in that regard. The conclusion in the next section is entirely justified, and I quote, "The idea that social justice is best served by restricting what can be said and by banning some ideas and terminologies and enforcing others is unsupported by history, evidence, or reason." That they give cultural relativism short shrift is bracing and welcome. Bringing this section to a resounding conclusion, they observe, and I quote, "We need feel no hesitation in supporting the equal rights, opportunities, and freedoms of all women, all LGBT people, and all racial and religious minorities, because these values don't belong to the West, but to all liberals everywhere." And they are everywhere. So no need for cultural relativism. Make a big concession in the section about the loss of the individual and the universal. Quote, "A liberalism that focuses solely on the individual and on humanity as a whole may fail to see how certain identity groups are disadvantaged. Greater attention to this aspect of identity is warranted, though not to the exclusion of all other concerns. Of course, they quickly follow this up by issuing a warning about how theory prefers to paint groups as uniform in opinion and outlook. And I quote again, "There is no unique voice of color or of women or of trans, gay, disabled, or fat people. Even a relatively small random sample drawn from any of those groups will reveal widely varying individual views." So they go through these principles and themes, and they try to do justice to what is of interest in them, but obviously the emphasis is upon critique and rejection, as we would have expected. My third question was, of course, do we learn enough about epistemic liberalism and liberalism generally in this chapter? And I'll finish off this lecture with a somewhat extended statement about this. In an important way, the book doesn't quite provide what certain kinds of humanities students need, I might be so bold as to suggest. The problem is that if you are, say, an English literature student at a university and you're being taught theory, the idea of a liberal alternative to what you're being offered is appealing but difficult to discern, perhaps. What is the liberal approach to the study of literature? It might feel for the reader of Cynical theories that what is getting said in this chapter applies more to social or human sciences rather than humanities. Another half criticism. In this book, the focus is on theory as a mode of thought, which comes up with answers to academic questions. What is less emphasized is that theory is something that gets applied to particular questions and provides answers by means of its application. And a criticism not advanced in the book is suggested by that use of theory. More often than not, theory gets applied, but by having a preferred theory and applying it to every problem he, she comes across, the theory-using scholar is routinely guilty of a priorism. My theory can produce great results no matter what the problem. I do think that if we dig around enough, we can find thoughtful pieces which address these issues and help us to understand a little bit more about epistemic liberalism. Let me direct your attention to some pieces which might help the student of literature get a sense of what epistemic liberalism means in that context. In his 1967 essay, Criticism as Inquiry, the literary critic R.S. Crane makes a bold statement about the necessity of rejecting what he calls a priorism. Good scholar possesses what Crane describes as, and I quote, a habitual distrust of the a priori. That is to say, of all ways of arriving at particular conclusions which assume the relevance and authority prior to concrete evidence of theoretical doctrines or other general propositions. In a piece called The Grand Academy of Theory, the critic Frederick Crews takes the baton from Crane. Crews is one of my favorite writers, primarily because of his hilarious send-up of the application of theories in his two spoof volumes, The Pooh Perplex and Postmodern Pooh, where he invents galleries of theory-obsessed scholars who provide outlandish interpretations of A. Milne's classic for children. But Crews is also a shrewd observer of theory. Citing Crane, Crews observes that before theory, most scholars would have agreed with Crane regarding scholarly procedure. But in Crews' day, and I quote, frank recourse to unsubstantiated theory is the order of the day. Crews broaches the subject of the anti-positivism of fashionable theorists, which we should think of as their rejection of not just positivism, but also of epistemic liberalism. Theorists can claim to be in the vanguard of thought. Their anti-positivism amounts to an opposition to, and I quote, the restriction of meaningfulness to verifiability in the foundationalist or scientific method sense. But, observes Kruse, their rejection of positivism extends to, quote, a feeling of non-obligation towards empiricism in the broad sense. I think a third essay, which follows on from the first two, is also of interest here, and we might briefly turn to it as well. Commenting on Kruse' essay as well as Crane's earlier piece, in his later essay, Masters and Demons, another great literary scholar, Brian Vickers, makes a very clear statement about what the right procedure is when dealing with texts. And perhaps it is here more than anywhere else that we get a sense of what epistemic liberalism involves within the context of a subject like English literature. He observes, rejecting any notion of positivism as privileging the natural sciences and their once upon a time claim to objective certainties, I stand by the empirical mode of intellectual practice, which appeals to the experience of reading in order to ground an argument by citing evidence from a usually printed text available to all, subject to interpretation and open discussion. If I might add a thought of my own to this sequence. Once you are sure that you have avoided an a priori approach, you might find it useful to apply a theory. Not one of the theories spoken of by Pluckrose and Lindsay. There are other theories, of course, theories beyond the range of the ones discussed in their book. I can render all of this a bit more concrete by reflecting on my own writing process, particularly how I went about writing my most recent book, which is a commentary on one of William Blake's poems. While conducting research for this book, I allowed an argument to take shape. The argument was based upon a good amount of rereading of the primary source, the Blake poem, as well as secondary sources, but not theory. I came to the conclusion that what was most striking about this narrative poem is that in it, physical action is almost entirely ineffective. What matters is what characters say in their speeches in the poem. When I had decided upon this main observation, I could turn to theory. I employed what is known as speech-act theory, and the theory helped me to make important distinctions between different categories of speech acts in the poem. So I could avoid a priori ideas, work independently of theory, but then turn to it at the right time. Hopefully my procedure was a match for the for what epistemic liberalism argues for with respect to research. Well, that brings this first lecture in the Liberal Bookshelf series to an end. The next course in this series the next courses will be live online courses. A number of different courses about aspects of classical liberalism suggest themselves to me. When I look at my own bookshelves, I see Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianov's The Coddling of the American Mind. I see Jonathan Rauch's The Constitution of Knowledge. I see less well-known volumes, such as Keynes' 20th Century Humanist Critics, which I alluded to earlier, and Annette Federico's engagements with close reading. Those books and others suggest interesting courses under the heading of the Liberal Bookshelf. Do please check the ILB website for more information about these courses and others over the next months and so on. And I very much hope that I'll have a chance to meet some of you who followed this course at some of our live events, some of my own courses, and it'd be great to discuss these issues face-to-face with you. Thank you for that. Bye-bye.